you. Hello.
Hi, yes, wonderful.
Oh,
Thank
yes.
you.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us at the Mid-Atlantic Teaching Artists Virtual Retreat. My name is Precious Blake and I work at the Maryland State Arts Council. This session will be recorded and later shared, so please turn off your video if you do not want to be recorded. Before we kick off the 2020 Mid-Atlantic Teaching Artists Virtual Retreat with our keynote remarks, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We are joining from different locations, but we acknowledge that every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. We acknowledge that we are currently standing on ancestral lands. We also honor the thousands of enslaved Africans whose lives were physically and spiritually stolen and have greatly contributed to the cultural fabric of the United States. We pay respects to our elders, past and present. The 2020 Mid-Atlantic Teaching Artists Virtual Retreat is a co-sponsored project of the Delaware Division of the Arts, Maryland State Arts Council, New Jersey State Council on the Arts, New York State Council on the Arts, Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, Virginia Commission for the Arts, and West Virginia Department of the Arts, Culture, and History, in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. We are grateful for their generous support of all of these collaborators. We would also like to acknowledge the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation and the Teaching Artists of the Mid-Atlantic, TAMA, as two other very important groups that support artists in our region. In particular, we'd like to remind you that TAMA hosts a TA Cafe for all Mid-Atlantic teaching artists every morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. For more information, visit teachingartist.org. I'll now turn things over to our producer, Susan Zoll, for a brief review of some technical housekeeping items before we officially get started.
Thank you, Precious. Hi, I'm Susan Zoll, and I will be your producer today, which means I'll be behind the scenes working on the technology with you. If you have any questions or issues, you can feel free to direct chat me. And I'll show you where you can do that if you're not yet familiar. But first I wanted to point out we are going to have an interpreter on. She's not yet on that I see, but we will have an interpreter. If you do want to pin the interpreter's video, you can do so by pointing at the webcam, and she will be identified by her name, interpreter-Lara, when she's able to log into the session. That's how you would pin the video. Feel free to chat me if there's any questions around that. If you want to see a gallery view so you can see everybody that has their webcam up, you would click on gallery view, as you can see in the top right of that image, to get everybody's webcam up. Now there is a limit that it will show you, and you may have to scroll through to see everybody that has their webcam on. But that's how you would do that. So on the next slide, I just want to let you know, if you get disconnected, please just try rejoining again using the same link. Usually that works. And as mentioned, this session is getting recorded. So if you do get bumped out, don't worry, you'll be able to catch up in the recording. And if you just click again a couple more, there's the recording. And then there is my cell phone number. If you get bumped out and can't get in, you might want to jot that down now. Feel free to give me a call and I will get back to you. So that's 610-864-8206. I'll chat it out as well if you missed that. Here's where you can click on chat. If you don't see your meeting controls, point and hover your cursor at the bottom of your screen and it should pop out. On the far right, you should see chat. If you click on that, you can open up the chat panel, and then at the bottom there is a place where you can switch to just, if you want to chat me directly, Susan Zoll, or chat everyone, switch it to that. Also is the participant panel. If you double click on the participant panel, this is where you could change your name. So if you want to hover over, once you pull out the participant panel, find your name, hover over it, it should say more, and then you get the option to rename yourself. So if anybody wants to, for example, put your pronouns in, you can enter them there, or change your name. If you came in with a different name, maybe you use someone else's login, you want to change it, you can feel free to do that. Go ahead and do that now if you want. Again, send me a chat if you have any questions. And then on the next slide, I'm going to show you some of ways you can engage in this session. So if any of you attended our session this morning, you may not have seen these, but you have now, should have at the bottom of your participant panel, a blue hand you can raise. So can everyone just raise their blue hand so I can see that you've found that? Again, you double click on the meeting controls where it says participant list, and at the bottom, there should be some icons there. So I do see some hands going up. Thank you for that. If you need to step away, there is a clock under more. If you just click on that to let us know or chat us, that's another good way to let us know you had to step away. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to you, Precious.
Thank you, Susan. I am pleased to introduce our keynote presenter, Michael O'Brien. Mike is an expert practitioner and a budding researcher in the fields of community development, organizational culture, and human well-being. He is currently an innovation fellow at Drexel University's Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation, and also serves as director of learning at the Village of Arts and Humanities, a nonprofit located in North Philadelphia. I encourage you all to read his very full and amazing biography on the retreat website. So once again, please welcome Mike to our virtual stage. Take it away, Mike.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. I wish we were in person. I wish I could take in all your eyes and soul energy and bond with all my fellow artists, my fellow teaching artists, makers, creatives. You know, I really appreciate all that we bring into spaces for young people and for adults and for all kinds of populations and folks. The world needs us more than ever. And I am really excited at this opportunity to share some ideas and thoughts with you about our current positionality in the world, what I believe the world needs from us, and what our opportunities are moving forward in this transitory space that the nation is in, and that the world, really the globe is in. But particularly for us as teaching artists in this country, like what world, are we inheriting currently, and what world do we want to leave for our children to inherit? And I think how we incorporate young people into the making of a new normal, right, is really, really, really important. And so, all that being said, I'm going to share some ideas with you today, really around the intersections of entrepreneurship, workforce development, and this idea of the artist creative maker. And I think that, hopefully we'll have some provocations, right, to get you thinking either in a new direction or to support and confirm some ideas that many of you have had or many of you are probably already doing, maybe even providing some language and framing around some of that work, or just supporting you in taking bolder steps even and going to folks with like, no, this is real stuff. And really promoting it and moving forward with how we begin to bridge ourselves over into a future that has like happened upon us in real time, right? I want to pay honor and respect to all those who have been impacted by everything that has transpired since March, even prior to March, but definitely since March. January feels like worlds and worlds away. So I definitely want to give honor and respect to all those who have been on the front lines of COVID-19 and on the front lines of the civic and social issues that are plaguing our country and have been plaguing our country for quite some time. And I want to give respect to those who are finding their way in all the ways that we have to do some wayfinding right now. All those finding their way through this journey and finding connectivity with each other. So with that said, I'm going to jump into some ideas. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. Chat box is being managed and questions are being collected. So please feel free to drop questions along the way. I will talk for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. I want to leave enough time for Q&A, even looking at the time now. I'll try to leave at least 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to try to move as fast as possible, not shortchange some ideas in some space. So again, I have been thinking about the future of work and this transition to the future of work for quite some years. Really, in my work going back about 6 years, I really started to dig into this journey of like, what does it mean to be thoughtful about the future and to build for the future right now? Many people call that futurism. There are aspects of futurism that shape around particular ethnic groups and identities. So there's Afrofuturism, there's Latinx futurism, and then there's futurism at large, right? And a huge chunk of futurism is built on this idea of how can people also extend and see themselves into the future? Can collective groups and wholes extend themselves and see themselves into a future? How can you begin to extend and imagine yourself and your well-being in the future? How could you design multiple pathways to get there, right? Futurism is not just about believing in a thing that's far off. It's about taking oneself and one's group and the world even sometimes and extending it from now all the way through the markers of time to get to a place in the future where you can actually then begin to manipulate time and thinking and start to imagine backwards and see the step before that ultimate destiny or destination, and then even see the step before that step. And you actually can end up with a pragmatic way of starting with speculative fiction and the wild imagination to begin to start honing in on actual things that could be done to bridge you into the world that you exactly want, when at times stress can block you from actually projecting yourself through time and imagining yourself at your best, or imagining the group that you identify with, or groups really that you identify with at your best into the future. So my journey again, and that started roughly around 2013, 2014. And one of the first things that I started to do was dig into the literature on like, how does this impact people's pockets? You know, I spent a lot of time developing my frameworks on the world by learning about art first. I did a series of professional theater engagements and projects from 14 to 18. I was super lucky. I went to Performing Arts High School in Hartford, Connecticut, the Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts. Shout out to all my teachers and everybody that shaped me to be the thinking man and creative man that I am today. But I was fortunate to go to that school, and fortunate again to get involved with humanitarian focus and social practice arts well before I ever knew what that term was. And I was fortunate enough to be making real, and what I mean by real is like situated in a context of young people and situated in the context of diverse communities, like real world art based on problems and challenges and hopes and dreams of these disparate and marginalized groups who can tend to be spoken for and not heard directly. And so learning how to do that with art and learning about things that other young people weren't learning about, I didn't realize how much of a gift that was and how it would continue to feed my soul over time. So by the time I was in my early 20s, I ended up getting involved at the intersections of art, mental health, and public health, and took a journey working with young people who were who had touched the justice system in some format, young people who had been in foster care, youth and families experiencing homelessness, vets who were in recovery. I was just working with so many different groups of people who had experienced many of life's highs, and many of life's lows, right? These low points of suffering and of pain. And I was able to use art in all of those situations and able to learn. I had to learn how to hear. I had to learn how to be quiet. I had to learn how to practice humility. I had to learn that people were really experts in their own lives, and that lived expertise in the wisdom that comes from living is actually worth honoring, even if you don't agree with people. That there's still a space to honor someone's perspective and lived wisdom. The other thing I learned in this journey of understanding people's experiences and learning about trauma and trauma theory and the impact that trauma and chronic stress has on bodies and brains and development, learning about how chronic stress and trauma impact systems even, because we have to remember that systems are ideated and powered by humans and are actually therefore by the laws of nature and complexity theory susceptible to the same kinds of sensitivities and developmental challenge points that humans are. And so one of the things that became clear to me is that as systems are vulnerable and people can experience vulnerability, that on both sides of that equation, nothing was happenstance. Sometimes we talk in America about market forces, and we talk about these larger societal forces as if they're boogeymen, right? Or boogie women, right? Or boogie people who are just like these weird things that exist in the ether, and they have these like random touch points with us and they're pushing our society. But one of the things that I think I've learned and grounded myself in is that all of these issues we're talking about and these forces actually, again, are ideated and powered by humans. So thinking about something like poverty that's impacting tons of people in Philadelphia, for example, and of course across the country, particularly in the context of COVID-19, as people are losing work and we have record unemployment, and we have, a diminishing of wages coming from the government to support people who are out of work and cannot find new work at the moment. One of the things that I had to organize myself around is that poverty is not some random market force or random data points. That actually the experience of poverty or other forms of hyper-marginalization, not just poverty, but often the experience of hyper-marginalization is by choice, and not by the choice of the people experiencing it, but by the choice of power, by the choice of people and systems who have power, right? Poverty is the result of choices in belief and choices in practice of values and what matters most. It is a choice of valuing land and valuing capital and valuing financial assets and resources and the things that help grow those over human life and people. This is a choice that we are making as a society, and the choice that people in power are making, the few over the many. And we have to sit in the fact that low wages are a choice, unfair hiring practices are choices, not paying women equally these are choices that we're making, or that people in power are making. And the reason I bring all of that up is because in the context of our transitory economy and trying to figure out like how artists are going to play a role in this future economy and what can we be doing now as we're transitioning and thinking about, again, people experiencing poverty and what's the big need, wages, money, big need, big need. And how are we going to think about, addressing the problem of the need for wages, family sustaining wages that are, accompanied by or engulfed in work? And on the flip side, how are we going to attend to the very real human needs at the same time? Human needs for healthy development, human needs for, addressing trauma and chronic stress. And what do you do when poverty is the source of a lot of chronic stress and trauma? It is the fact that a lot of people cannot take care of their base level of needs, food, shelter, clothing, housing, that folks are stressed and experiencing trauma. So it's this weird chicken and egg loop. And I was just sitting in all that soup and like, there's gotta be a way to figure out some stuff. And luckily about 3 years ago, the information on this slide, about 3 or 4 years ago, this information on this slide became available. And it got me thinking that if what's going to make a human resilient in the market, in terms of market forces, it's going to make someone resilient in the face of automation and the threat of technology, removing lots of jobs or replacing lots of jobs, are human-centered skills that technology can't replace. I found that interesting. I was like, well, wait a minute. These are skill sets that I know arts environments and arts instructors are hand over foot qualified to help grow and qualified to help build the environments that shape these skill sets and character virtues, and not just children, but also other adults. But what got me next was this question about what makes us human. And the reason I got to this question is my own artistic process and my research-based process start in the same place. I start with questions. I'm insatiably curious. And I start with questions because they lead me down a path of discovery where I get to share in the learning. I'm going to be learning from people. I'm going to be learning from reading. It's a bi-directional learning journey where I'm learning and then I'm sharing back to people what I'm learning. And by default, then they're sharing back to me what thoughts come from them, right? So I like to lead with questions because I find it to be absolutely invigorating and a process that allows, again, for bi-directionality in the learning. And so again, in thinking about, well, what skills are resilient in the face of automation and technology, and it's this idea that the human-centered skills are, the next question for me was, well, then what makes us human? And the reason I had to ask this question is because the truth of the matter is, for our country, we've mostly answered this question in the form of negation, right? It's really been about what makes X group human and therefore this group non-human. And we really focused on the non-humanity piece for the point of subjugation, right? Be it Black people, be it, people of color at large, be it folks from, lower socioeconomic status backgrounds, Eastern Europeans, Jews. I mean, there have been a lot of people. America's been very articulate at describing who is not considered worthy of humanity. You can look up redlining practices on this. I mean, there are very clear and discrete hierarchies written up in order of who's desirable and not to live in an area, receive a loan, receive homeowners insurance, America's been very clear for centuries about who's worthy of humanity and who's not. And so in the 21st century, when we've all grown up in racism, sexism, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, you name it, we have a mollywop, is what my kids used to say. My young folks used to say, we have a mollywop. We have a cascade of isms and phobias that have shaped our thinking around this concept of humanity, to the point where I like to push that our new social contract in the 21st century is built on the concept of equity that leads us to shared humanity. That is the journey. But we have to begin to investigate and interrogate, whoa, there are so many blocks and blinders up for us to even begin the process of figuring out, what does it mean to have shared humanity? And so I dug even deeper. And I said, well, let's think about the fact that biologically, Homo sapiens sapiens, that's our technical designation, biologically, Homo sapiens sapiens are social organisms. Our biology and our social nature are forever intertwined. And so I said, maybe I need to take a deeper dive and look at what developmental science has to say about human beings and our relationship to environments as social creatures. And here's what I discovered, that by the late 90s, we had figured out enough to say that development is biopsychosocial, right? And they're not verticals, they're circles that are subsumed within one another. They're concentric. That human development, and one aspect of what makes us human, is that we are developing in multiple dimensions at the same time. So health and harm are created and sustained in all three of these dimensions by what is around us, what's happening in us internally in terms of our understanding of the world, because physiological phenomena is amazing of what happens on the inside connected to things like emotions and feelings. And again, harm and hurt are often sustained by the choices of larger society, not just the choices of the individual that's developing. So skill set development by default is happening within the context of biopsychosocial development. Now, what was also fascinating here is that by 2002, we started to talk about multiple dimensionalities of meaning making and reasoning and understanding, that humans do have a spiritual nature. We look for meaning even when there is no meaning present. You put as an example, put a bunch of young people into an art gallery, even adults, but definitely a bunch of young people in an art gallery, and ask them some priming questions about what they're seeing and why they think they're seeing it. And they will start to come up with some ideas and thoughts and some reasoning. Same with adults, right? We will make up meaning where there is none. That's because human beings are narrative driven. Not all people think in narrative, but for the most part, what we know about the brain, particularly the hippocampus, it's a section of your brain that connects to the prefrontal cortex, to some other parts of your brain. The hippocampus, one of its responsibilities is helping you do two things. There's a bunch of responsibilities, but there's two really interesting ones. One is it puts a timestamp on your events in life. The other thing it does is help translate experiences and feelings into words. And this is why I say, while everyone might not by default go to narrative, humans by default are biologically narrative creatures moreover than not. So this space around meaning making and processing and understanding got us into this space around, well, we've got to now name that space. And so that's what spiritual means here. It's not about religion or being religious, right? Religion is actually technically, we think from an anthropological lens, religion is a way of organizing aspects of spirituality and then culturally handing it down. But religion is not technically spirituality, right, in this context. When we're talking about development, we're talking about the space of meaning making and reasoning with things that typically are larger than life and don't actually always have the clearest answers. So this is where development is in the 21st century. Biomedical models are using this more and more. Developmentalists are using this. Social workers are using this to understand the full context of, you know, their clients' life history and what's been impacting them or not, for better or for worse. And so skill development, and again, all harm or safety is going to be happening at all 4 of these dimensions, and a couple of other nuances. You don't necessarily, I'll go back to the slide for a second, you don't necessarily get the choice as to whether or not you're going to develop or impact this one area or another. All 4 of these dimensions can be looked at independently in terms of wanting to hone in on one and understand something about the nature of that dimension of development and understand how people reason with it, are impacted by it, how it plays out in process and relationships with individuals, etc. But on the flip side, as teaching artists, as stewards of space and caretakers of environments that other people are coming into to learn skills, both technical within the art form, but also behavioral or soft skills, according to workforce development literature, behavioral skills being things like creativity, conflict management, communication skills, etc., right? We have to think about the fact that when we are developing these environments and activities that are supposed to facilitate skill development, it's happening across all these dimensions. We don't get a choice in picking which one. And people don't get a choice to pick which one is going to like be their main one or what they're going to focus on. With that said, I do want to talk about some disruptors, right? When I talked about how can harm be created in those dimensions and how can safety be created in those dimensions, let's focus on harm for a second. Chronic stress is a toxic phenomenon to the body. It's something called allostatic load. I invite you all to look up and think about once you've looked it up. But really quickly, allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body as a whole mechanism based on the overactivation of the stress response mechanism or the stress response system. And so here's 5 examples of chronic stressors that, regardless of the income level, are actually still pretty stressful. For example, parenting alone. Doesn't matter how much money you make. If your kid is desiring your presence, money, especially at ages 2, 1, 3, 4, money is not replacing that for the child. And there's nothing you can do about the fact that you can only be in one place at one time and you have a job and blah, 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 blah. That's stressful. Especially when the child starts to, let's say they are developing a deep relationship with the nanny or pair, whoever the caretaker is, when you're at work or you're doing whatever, again, regardless of how much money you have, right? Child still wants you or wants a caretaker. What's it like for that parent when the baby's crying and the parent can't soothe the baby because the baby really wants the caretaker who's around them 24/7, which is the nanny? That's complicated, right? And already stressful inherently, no matter how much money you have, again. Let's then think about like the reduction of funds makes all of these even more complicated and stressful. They're chronic because they don't let up. We also call it relentlessly stressful. But the other thing to consider now is trauma. Now, all traumas are inherently stressful, but not all stressors are inherently traumatic. This creates a bit of a conundrum for us when we're thinking about development. Excuse me, and those 4 dimensional inputs around health, safety, harm. And again, these are that is the backdrop of which all skill development is happening in, right? It is in the context of development and in the context of relationship that skill development is happening. And that skill development has biological, psychological, social, and spiritual or meaning-making inputs. Chronic stress complicates that, and so does trauma. And what's most important to point out here, in my opinion, is that trauma involves a perceived or literal threat, meaning that we cannot tell another person what is traumatic for them or not. And if we don't know, what we have to do is create lanes of relationship. Again, think about these dimensions of development as inputs, spaces, lanes. We have lanes within development by which we can build trusting relationships with people and which they can then utilize to share story with us. We focus, there's a lot of language in the field around giving voice. And I always balk at that and go, wait, let's push back at that idea. I can't give you voice. What I can do is make space for your voice. I can amplify your voice. I can intimidate your voice. I can silence your voice. I can diminish your voice. I can teach you ways to use media, art, and other skills and tools to amplify or disseminate your voice. But the one thing I cannot do is give you voice, because it is my belief that people are born with voice. Just look at children. They are born curious for the most part, right? They are born going into the world over time through development, exploring. Right? It's whether or not we as the adults or older folks around them are encouraging that nature or suppressing it, right? But that's not us giving voice. Maybe what we're doing is giving liberty for said person to utilize their voice, but I'm not giving voice. And I think it's very important that we make that distinction, because it starts to level out feelings of hierarchy, dimensions of power, which when we're talking about trauma is really important, because one of the dimensions of trauma, one of the key components of the definition is helplessness and a lack of control. That is powerlessness. And so again, centering back on the fact that I can't give you voice, that inherently you have voice. What I can do is encourage your voice, amplify, magnify, make space for your voice, share room on a platform for your voice, right? And I think, again, that kind of perception is really important when we're talking about people who have been impacted by trauma. And what we need to do is help the story come out. As artists, we are uniquely positioned to do that and to support environments, the design and build of environments and relationships that can do that. And so this is what a lot of us are working with in the country, particularly right now. We are working with people who are living at the intersection of chronic stressors and traumatic experiences, some that are either historic and not resolved, some that are, ongoing, plus history not resolved. That is exponentially toxic. Again, the stress response system going off all willy-nilly in the body 24/7 is absolutely toxic to the body, to the brain. It erodes brain architecture, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is where judgment and planning sit. Inhibitory control, what we like to call things like maturity. A lot of that sits there. And if you can't imagine 15 minutes into the future, it's really hard to imagine your life into the future. And what's interesting about the nuances of trauma is, like, even if you can imagine into the future, a lot of times it's not an optimistic future. It's hard to imagine an optimistic future where things work in your favor. And it's very easy to imagine your future extended out through the lens of the traumas and through the lens of the kind of constraint or constrained choices that came along with the traumatic experience. And so teaching artists have this and just artists and creatives in general that work with groups of people, we have this phenomenal opportunity to introduce methods of making and creativity that help people imagine into the future through fiction that can then actually cross over very easily to them imagining their own selves fictitiously into a future that was hard before having those tools and having that kind of access and liberty of space to do such. So here's where this all starts to combine to me. And this is where the research got really fascinating for me. On the left, you're looking at a literature review I found that looked at the successful character traits and leadership domains and skill sets for successful entrepreneurs and CEOs. On the right, where it says well-being, you're looking at another literature review I found that looked at the character virtues, what were deemed character virtues and skill sets that buffer something called psychopathology, or the deterioration of one's mental health, right? And one could argue very clearly that habitual traumas or trauma unresolved that is still wreaking havoc in your life, experiencing chronic stressors plus trauma, that exponentially toxic space for the human body, psyche, and soul, that will contribute to the deterioration of one's mental health or to psychopathology. Now, what was fascinating for me was looking at these two lists and going like, oh my gosh, these are very, very similar. So then I just mapped them next to each other and we're like, whoa, they're really, really similar. And so what we're really talking about is this prioritization of the growth of soft skills, right? The growth of these core human skills that technology cannot completely fabricate or replicate, not with fidelity, right? That these are the skills also needed to best partner with technology to be able to answer challenges and problems that we've never ever been able to exactly face before or solve in this manner before. And these are really, really, really difficult to measure, particularly at the individual level, but also in thinking about environmental design, they're hard to measure for like how effective was the environment in producing these character virtues in particular, like courage, because courage isn't a skill set, it's what they call virtue, because it's what you do out of that space that could be considered a skill, not the state of having courage, right? But it is a thing that can be developed and refined. It is a thing that could be defined, right? But this is all, we're still nascent stages, very early stages of figuring out all of this. But it's clear, a couple of things are very clear here, that, excuse me, to get to these core skill sets that are human, you also need to invest in the space of developing character virtues. And here's the flip side, right? Not all CEOs and entrepreneurs actually have a good sense of well-being. So while these are things to aspire and ascertain how we get there, right, and what we could be doing with young people to invest in them to make sure they're growing these things, we also know that, again, with the way I grew, all research is a little bit faulty. I just want to put that out there, right? No research is 100% totally accurate. Like, there's just a lot of understanding and nuance, right? And what I mean, and I don't mean that like biomedical research is not accurate. It just means that everything needs to be contextualized and understood in the context of who, what, where, when, how, and why, right? And so all that being said, we know that there are a number of entrepreneurs and CEOs in our country that are not at their healthiest, right? When economic forces hit, when people make choices, right? So economic forces move a certain way, we know that people's health can be compromised. So in no way am I trying to say that this literature review proves that people practicing entrepreneurship are 100% healthy. What I am trying to get at in all of this is that we have some beginning ideas and understandings about the skill sets and character virtues and leadership domains that could be invested in, could be grown to help people prepare for the future of work. And I am presenting to you that I think that artists, teaching artists, and creatives are probably the most appropriate folks to design environments, spaces, and places and relationships that help build and fortify these skill sets in children and adults, particularly with adults that need to make lateral transitions in the workplace. And we don't have these like amazing finishing centers for soft skills and for behavioral skills. That actually, what's it like to think about embedding adults in dope social practice arts projects where they have to talk to people who are different from them. They have to do some media digital storytelling projects and around those people and around those stories that are different from them. And they have to do things like practice courage by talking to people that they don't normally talk to, because many of us are good at staying in our boxes. What's it like to have to develop a different set of skills around insight, around analysis, by asking deeper questions? The art of asking questions is actually very, very difficult. We call it question crafting in research. Very, very difficult. What's it like to use artistic environments and play? Developmental, this is the other thing I love about art. It's developmentally appropriate play. It can develop and mature with people along the lifespan, but still be fun, still be full of joy, awe, and wonder, that taps into childlike awe, but allows you to still refine it to match the sophistication of the people who are present in front of you developmentally. So again, if we think about art as developmentally appropriate play and ways for people to develop skill sets that they might have missed out on at prior times in their educational experiences and learning, what kind of opportunities do we have to equip a world, not just for the future of work, but to equip a world around well-being, to equip a world that is increasingly going to have to figure out, how to attend to the developmental well-being of human beings at all four of these levels, when we have to still contend with racism, sexism, transphobia, and homophobia. This is where, again, I think we have an opportunity as teaching artists and entrepreneurs to be thinking about new business structures and co-ops that can start to house these experiences for people and for students and for systems, right? We have tools to help people express story and nuance and meaning without having to talk directly. That's powerful. So I want to offer to you some thoughts around how empathy can function for us in the world. I think empathy is better practiced selfishly. If I have more time, I talk about this with some depth, a little more depth, but I want to be quick. If you've never had someone's life experience, you actually, or like a shared identity-based experience, you actually have no bearings for understanding their experiences in the world. I'll be a little more clear. I'm a Black male, I'm a Black cis male who's also queer. There are certain nuances about the world that I understand that I know other queer people can understand. Non-queer people might not get it, and that's fine. Non-Black people are not gonna understand the Black experience. I'm also a cis man. I don't understand the experience of gender non-conforming folks, and I don't understand the experiences of women walking down the street. And that, for me to assume that I can, actually minimizes their narratives, diminishes their experiences. It magnifies my positionality and experiences in the world, as opposed to honoring and affirming their experiences and existence in the world, and can actually do the opposite of what empathy is supposed to do, which is help people bond and bridge to one another. So rather than, and I'll give you another example, cancer. If I've never had cancer, I don't know what it's like to have cancer. And to assume I can, again, minimizes, diminishes the whole nine. And it's going to actually, again, like magnets that repel, it's going to push you away from each other on what you want to do to try to establish, to go back for 2 seconds, to try to establish healthy inputs that combat the harm that can be created at all four of these levels and reinstitute safety in those levels, is you do want to bond and bridge, because again, we're social organisms. We've got to bond with one another, and we have to bridge over our divides. So here's a different thought after going through lots of the empathy research and literature. What happens if we start a little selfishly, and instead of trying to identify with someone around a social factor or an identity-based experience, we actually go inward and identify an emotional experience that we might have had, that another person might have had or be having in any given moment, or connected to some life experiences that you know that they've gone through. Here's a list of some effective experiences or emotional experiences that are negative, and I picked the negative ones for the moment because they're visceral. What's it like for me to think about another person, again, different social factors, different identity, and go, you know what? I don't know how those identities show up for that person in the world and how it complicates or encourages them in whatever way. But I do know what it's like to feel powerless. I do know what it's like to feel disoriented and confused in a given moment when I'm kind of thrown in a room and I'm the only Black person in the whole room. Could that be what it's like if a woman's thrown into a room of all men? Could she feel disoriented and confused? Maybe, but if I can identify that first on the inside and go, here are some of those feelings when I've been kind of marginalized and ostracized, et cetera, or felt like I didn't belong, felt uncomfortable. Here are some of the emotional experiences I was having in that moment. And if I can then use that to think about the experience of the other person and also honor that, because I don't know the social factors or the identity-based experiences that might be bringing on the emotional experiences of that person, I don't even know if what I'm identifying on the inside could be 20, 10, 30 times magnified for that person. But I have a much more accurate starting place than an assumption through an identity lens that I have never walked in, won't ever touch, that leads me to minimizing and repelling versus bonding and bridging. Because if I can identify the feeling, again, recognize that even with that feeling, it might not be showing up for that person in the same way. It gives me the opportunity to say, wow, when I felt like that, I know how I wanted people to show up for me. I know how I couldn't show up for myself in that moment. And now I can ask the next question of, how can I be a better ally? How can I be a better listener? How can I actually attune to that person and help figure out how I can show up for you in this moment? And what do you need me to do or show up as in these other moments in your existence, in this space and place with us, as we're trying to attune to your well-being and your best? And then I'm not getting lost in like, oh, well, what's it like to be Black? How do I not? How do I? And I'm attuning to the humanity of the person without minimizing their very precious and core and the needing to be honored identity that they're living in. Again, this is a starting place to building some bridges to operationalize empathy in a way that moves us towards collective action of operationalizing, right, shared humanity. And again, I think artists are uniquely positioned to do this. And I do think there are opportunities for us in the market. So here's what we can solve as artists. There are two core problems here that the world is facing when it comes to the intersection of well-being and economics. And this is just some of the ways that I'm thinking about these things and communicating them outward. Here's how I see this showing up in the world in terms of like market demand. But this, I didn't really like this, right? Because so much of this framing was focused on how do we make marginalized people ready for a job? And I was just like, well, wait a minute. How are we making sure that environments and institutions are doing their work and are building environments that are inclusive and ready to receive and honor the lived experience, lived expertise, and wisdom of the people coming through the door, and also recognizing that the design of their institutions and the design of their spaces, their classrooms even, are not built to honor the nuances of identity and spaces of difference in people that should be celebrated and encouraged, not diminished and shut down because the institution just doesn't know how to deal with it. In the 21st century, that's just not acceptable. And again, I think as artists, this is where we have a unique opportunity to be utilizing our skill sets in ways that can teach for belongingness, in ways that can teach, again, those skill sets and help refine certain character virtues through project-based learning, through all kinds of things that are appropriate for young people, but are actually also developmentally appropriate for adults. And so for me, I had to think about reorganizing this whole endeavor. And it's a learning-based endeavor, right? That there are marginalized individuals and communities that have to deal with bias, both the bias mechanism in them that can keep them from wanting to do things or trying to do things, because again, it is a form of bias that has the mind click on and go, oh my God, nothing's ever gonna work right? Bias is about prediction as much as, and the imagination, as much as we think about bias as it being connected to, you know, forms of discrimination. Self-discrimination, not just based on race or gender, is also a phenomenon of the body and part of the bias mechanism as well. The bias mechanism is a pretty complex endeavor and something that we need to spend a lot of time in and not have it be relegated just to issues around race and gender, even though those are really important and we should highlight them. But this bias piece is creating a lack of access to family-sustaining wages, to jobs, to entrepreneurship, to the skill set development opportunities that will create an inclusive economy, that will create, excuse me, let me get rid of, trying to get rid of that, there we go. That will, messing myself up here. There we go. Trying to get back to that side, there we go. That will create the opportunity for people to sustain themselves. So here's where I find we land, right? Work is a place where we practice and learn human skills. And the human skills that need to be refined, again, teaching artists and creatives have some of the best tools to help people get these skill sets down. You wanna learn teamwork, you gotta work in an ensemble, do some theater work. You don't even gotta get on stage and do a whole production, but just being in the environment, right? And I'll tell you something about environments really briefly. Environments, according to Harvard Center for the Developing Child, provide neuronal scaffolding for the development of skill sets. So think about the environments that we're shaping in moments where we're learning theater through the lens of ensemble work. It's fascinating opportunity to learn things about teamwork, to learn things about group practice and ritual that can be extended to the workplace by far. We must define, design, and iterate what inclusivity, belongingness, equity, and justice looks like on a systems level. Again, when I think about the imaginative faculty and the imagination necessary to define, design, and iterate that stuff, we have ways of using fiction, speculative fiction, media, design, story circles to help people practice the dreaming aspect, and like training wheels, keep them rolling through the building of those muscles, and then eventually taking the training wheels off and allowing people to continue through it. I don't even have to give you examples because I bet many of you as teaching artists have seen young people practice these things. I think we need to extend it to adults. And again, there are opportunities to build businesses, co-ops, all kinds of entrepreneurial ways to help all ages develop these skill sets. And lastly, we're all learners. So even we as the people that could be leading some of this journey, we could be learning as well along the whole way. And that bidirectional learning feedback just makes the products, makes the services, makes the environment even richer. So with that said, I'm gonna stop now so we can take a couple of questions. And I hope this was clear and you got something out of it. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Mike.
No problem.
From the questions that were put in the chat, I think we'll have time to get your information or get your reflections from two of them. And from Terry, she wants to hear your comment on this particular quote. Although acknowledging the arts and humanities may not contribute to shareholder wealth, Christopher Michelson sees them as supporting a more humane form of capitalism in which objects and persons of no apparent value, a work of art, or a needy non-stakeholder warrant our attention for their own sake. How can we get to this?
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk, I can reflect on that through the idea of abolitionism, right, or being an abolitionist, right? I'm an abolitionist at my core. It means I do not believe in the function of the justice system as it currently exists at all. I also understand how systems are slow, very slow and reticent to change. And so for me and my practicing values, I don't believe in 100% or zero. I work towards 100% abolition, understanding that my first step is to minimize harm as much as possible and remove as many young people and adults from a trajectory that will cause them harm. And so with that viewpoint, it allows me to negotiate and navigate and stay in my sense of integrity and ethics. It allows me to negotiate and navigate how I translate that work out and start to develop metrics and identify what my win is, attain that win, and then get to the next one, right? And so I think in this space, we're gonna have to, until capitalism crumbles and falls, because I'm actually one of those folks that doesn't believe that capitalism is going to save the world. I don't believe that Black capitalism is going to save Black people. So with that being said, I do believe that we're gonna have to have one foot in and one foot out. One foot in the future, one foot in the present, with an understanding of history at our back and the way that it presses us forward and be informed by all of it. And then we have to make choices therein, but it's gotta center on our values and our integrity and how do we center humanity in the conversation? So my job is to figure out how do you give the employers what they need in a way that still centers humanity? How do we give people what they need in the way that still centers humanity? And we're minimizing harm at the same time that we're maximizing the opportunity for people to be who they are, have autonomy, define themselves as they like to be defined, and move forward towards having family-sustaining wages that allow people to create health and well-being for themselves and allow us to invest in the children who can then take this journey on to the next step and grow it even further. That's the best way I can answer that question.
No, I think that was wonderful. A lot of people in the chat are sending emojis and clapping hands. So another question to kind of wrap us up, which I think is really reticent right now, is as teaching artists, what adjustments will we need to make in order to achieve this financial programming wellness success in this new reality that you've presented to us? That's
a great question. So a couple of things. You got to see yourself as a business. And it sucks because I know, like, I hate capitalism. I really do. Like, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying that, but it's fine. I think capitalism creates so much harm, right? Like, I mean, inherently, the way that particularly American capitalism, the way that we practice capitalism, it just creates so much harm by default. And that's why I don't like it, right? And so I do think there is a third way forward. And I think we're in a space where, because of the volatility of the market and the volatility of the employment landscape right now, there is this opportunity to solve problems. What I appreciate about entrepreneurship is that it does force you to figure out what problem are you actively trying to solve and how uniquely positioned are you to solve it and why. Why should someone care? Why does it matter? Who are the real stakeholders? not your shareholders, right? We are moving away from shareholder perspectives and have to start moving into stakeholder perspectives, because sometimes it's the shareholder who pays, but it's the stakeholder that makes or breaks the whole endeavor, right? And that's a different way of thinking about this idea of shared humanity and this shared space. So if you think about yourself as a business that does not have to do anything but hopefully survive, answer problems, right? You got to survive. You got to answer, you got to articulate a clear problem and answer it. And then you got to have a clear defined way, even if it's iterative over time, you have a clear defined starting place of what you're doing to solve that problem and be able to communicate it with some fidelity outward to other people and stakeholders. I think that's a beginning way to start this. You can do it with groups, you can do it individually. There are opportunities, and instead of everybody going out to start a new nonprofit, I invite you to think about fiscal sponsorship. What's it like to take your programming idea and put it under another nonprofit? And that way, with a memorandum of understanding, right, and a contract that clearly delineates what's yours and what are your responsibilities versus what's the org's and what's the org's responsibility, people overlook fiscal sponsorship a lot. Because the other thing is, like, flipping my hat, I do deal with philanthropy a lot, both as an advisor and then also at the national level and local level. And then I'm on some local foundation boards in Philadelphia. What people forget is, like, the foundation world is not very nice to new nonprofits. And this is, again, where you flip the lens and go as a startup, whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit, you're a startup. As a startup, what is my way to access capital so that I actually can build a sustainable business to solve the very needed problem, to solve the problem that very much so needs a solution? And the tricky part with new nonprofits is you're not even eligible for big grants. And by big, I mean 10,000, over 10 to 20,000 bucks, right? You're not even eligible for that until 3 to 5 years in with audits. And audits are not cheap when you're a small org. So you gotta think about, like, what is going to create the least amount of roadblocks to me accessing capital so that I can be sustainable and hyper-focused on the problem. When you're fiscally sponsored, you're under the 501c3 of that sponsoring organization. So if they've got 20 years in business with 17 years worth of audits, that's what you're using when you apply. And now all of a sudden, you could only get up to 10 to 15, maybe 20,000 as a new nonprofit with a year in, and under fiscal sponsorship, you and that org could go in on $150,000. I mean, it is a game changer to think about how to maneuver the startup world as a not-for-profit entity and to do that in a way that allows you the best access to capital. But again, that's what I mean by you gotta think about yourself as a business, be clear on the problem you're trying to solve, how you do it, and what the way you can articulate that story to the key stakeholders that can help you move that forward. And fiscal sponsorship is a great way to start.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really resonated with a lot of what you said. So thank you everyone for attending today's Teaching Artists Virtual Retreat opening event. Recordings of this keynote and all workshops will be available on NASA's YouTube channel within the week. Before we end, I'd like to just take a minute to hear from you about how this keynote resonated with you. I heard a lot of amazing things in the chat. Our producer will post a very quick poll just so we can get the feelings from the group in a quick second. So producer, if you can just pop up that poll about how this event resonated with you. So did it enhance your understanding, well organized, professional, provided you with any new ideas or strategies? And as you're completing that poll, please don't forget to watch out for your inbox for a brief survey every Friday to let us know what you think throughout the week. We hope you will join us for tomorrow's workshops, which will be the power of ritual practices and side hustle, how to get seen, heard, and paid. So it'll go through the wellness pieces of what Mike just mentioned, and also the nuts and bolts of how to get paid in your teaching artist work. You can find the full schedule on NASA's website. And you are free to join us on the Facebook group to continue the conversation. There were some amazing questions that I think would be great for a community discussion. So thank you everyone. Fill out the poll that was just submitted and have a wonderful rest of your day. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thank you to Mike, of course, for your amazing keynote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing
Thank you
work.
all so much.